The New Zealand Wars were a series of armed conflicts that took place in New Zealand from 1845 to 1872 between the New Zealand government and indigenous Maori. Up till the 1960s, Europeans referred to them as the Maori Wars, and historian James Belich was one of the first to refer to them as the New Zealand Wars. In 1987, in his book The New Zealand Wars and the Victorian Interpretation of Racial Conflict, though the wars were initially localized conflicts triggered by tensions over disputed land purchases, they escalated dramatically from 1860 as the government became convinced it was facing a united Maori resistance to further land sales and a refusal to acknowledge Crown sovereignty. The government summoned thousands of British troops to mount major campaigns to overpower the Māori King Movement and also acquire farming and residential land for British settlers. Later campaigns were aimed at quashing the so-called How movement, an extremist part of the Pai Māori religion, which was strongly opposed to the alienation of Maori land and eager to strengthen Maori identity. At the peak of hostilities in the 1860s, 18,000 British troops, supported by artillery, cavalry and local militia, battled about 4,000 Maori warriors in what became a gross imbalance of manpower and weaponry. Although outnumbered, the Maori were able to withstand their enemy with techniques that included anti-artillery bunkers and the use of carefully placed pa, or fortified villages, that allowed them to block their enemy advance and often inflict heavy losses, yet quickly abandon the positions without significant loss. Guerrilla-style tactics were used by both sides in later campaigns, often fought in dense bush. Over the course of the Taranaki and Waikato campaigns, the lives of about 1,800 Maori and 800 Europeans were lost, and total Maori losses over the course of all the wars may have exceeded 2,100. Violence over land ownership broke out first in the Wairau Valley in the South Island in June 1843, but rising tensions in Taranaki eventually led to the involvement of British military forces at Waitara in March 1860. The war between the government and Kingitānga Maori spread to other areas of the North Island, with the biggest single campaign being the invasion of Waikato in 1863–64, before hostilities concluded with the pursuits of warlord Rewhatito Kawaru in Taranaki and guerrilla fighter Te Kutiariki Rangi Te Turuki on the east coast. Although Maori were initially fought by British forces, the New Zealand government developed its own military force, including local militia, rifle volunteer groups, the specialist forest rangers and pro-government Maori. The government also responded with legislation to imprison Maori opponents and confiscate expansive areas of the North Island for sale to settlers, with the funds used to cover war expenses. Punitive measures that on the east and west coasts provoked an intensification of Maori resistance and aggression. Background: the 1840 Treaty of Waitangi guaranteed that individual Maori iwi should have undisturbed possession of the lands, forests, fisheries and other taonga in return for becoming British subjects, selling land to the government only and surrendering sovereignty to the British government. Historians, however, have debated whether Maori signatories fully understood this last point, due to the possible mistranslation of the word sovereignty in the treaty copies. The majority of Maori wanted to sign in order to consolidate peace and in the hope of ending the long intertribal musket wars. They also wished to acquire the technological culture of the British. All pre-treaty colonial land sale deals had taken place peace directly between two parties. In the early period of contact, Maori generally sought trade with Europeans. The British and the French established mission stations, and missionaries received land from iwi for houses, schools, churches and farms. Traders, Sydney businessmen and the New Zealand Company had bought large tracts of land before 1840, and the British government at Westminster became concerned about protecting Maori from exploitation. As part of the Treaty of Waitangi, colonial authorities decreed that Maori could sell land only to the Crown. But as the New Zealand colonial government, pressured by immigrant European settlers, tried to speed up land sales to provide farmland, it met resistance from the Māori King Movement, or King, which emerged in the 1850s and opposed further European encroachment. Governor Thomas Gore Browne's provocative purchase of a disputed block of land at Waitara in 1859 set the government on a collision course with the King movement, and the government interpreted the King response as a challenge to the Crown's authority. Governor Gore Browne succeeded in bringing 3,500 imperial troops from the Australian colonies to quash this perceived challenge, and within 4 years a total of 9,000 British troops had arrived in New Zealand, assisted by more than 4,000 colonial and Kupapa fighters as the government sought a decisive victory over the rebel Maori. The use of a punitive land confiscation policy from 1865, depriving rebel Maori of the means of living, fueled further Maori anger and resentment, fanning the flames of conflict in Taranaki and on the East Coast. Conflicts. The various conflicts of the New Zealand Wars span a considerable period, and the causes and outcomes differ widely. The earliest conflicts in the 1840s happened at a time when Maori were still the predominant power, but by the 1860s settler numbers and resources were much greater. From about 1862 British troops began arriving in much greater number, summoned by Governor George Grey for his Waikato invasion, and in March 1864 total troop numbers peaked at about 14,000, 9,000 imperial troops, more than 4,000 colonial and a few hundred Kupapa. The Wairau Fray, the first armed conflict between Maori and the European settlers, took place on the 17th of June 1843 in the Wairau Valley, in the north of the South Island. The clash was sparked when settlers led by a representative of the New Zealand Company, which held a false title deed to a block of land, attempted to clear Maori off the land ready for surveying. The party also attempted to arrest Ngāti Toa chiefs Te Rauparaha and Te Rangi Hareata. Fighting broke out and 22 Europeans were killed, as well as 4 to 6 Maori. Several Europeans were slain after being captured. In early 1844, the new governor, Robert Fitzroy, investigated the incident and declared the settlers were at fault. The Wairau Fray, described as the Wairau Massacre in early texts, was the only armed conflict to take place in the South Island. The Northern War, the Flagstaff War, took place in the far north of New Zealand, around the Bay of Islands, between March 1845 and January 1846. In 1845, George Grey arrived in New Zealand to take up his appointment as governor. At this time Hone Heke challenged the authority of the British, beginning by cutting down the flagstaff on Flagstaff Hill at Kororareka. The flagstaff had previously flown the colours of United Tribes of New Zealand but now carried the Union Jack and therefore symbolised the grievances of Heke and his ally Te Haruki Kauiti. As to changes that had followed the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi, there were many causes of the Flagstaff War, and Heke had a number of grievances in relation to the Treaty of Waitangi. While land acquisition by the Church Missionary Society had been controversial, the rebellion led by Heke was directed against the colonial forces, with the CMS missionaries trying to persuade Heke to end the fighting. Despite the fact that Tamati Wakanene and most of Ngāpuhi sided with the government, the small and ineptly led British had been beaten at Battle of Orawai, Grey, armed with the financial support and far more troops armed with 32-pounder cannons that had been denied to Fitzroy, attacked and occupied Kauiti's fortress at Ruapekipeka, forcing Kauiti to retreat. Heke's confidence waned after he was wounded in battle with Tamati Wakanene and his warriors, and by the realization that the British had far more resources than he could muster, including some Pakeha Maori, who supported the colonial forces. After the Battle of Ruapekipeka, Heke and Kauiti were ready for peace. It was Tamati Wakanene they approached to act as the intermediary to negotiate with Governor Grey, who accepted the advice of Nene that Heke and Kauiti should not be punished for the rebellion. The fighting in the north ended and there was no punitive confiscation of Ngāpuhi land. Hutt Valley and Wanganui campaigns. The Hutt Valley Campaign of 1846 came as a sequel to the Wairau Fray. The causes were similar: dubious land purchases by the New Zealand Company and the desire of the settlers to move on to land before disputes over titles were resolved, and the two conflicts shared many of the same protagonists. The campaign's most notable clashes were the Maori Dawn raid on an imperial stockade at Bulcott's Farm on 16 May 1846, in which 8 British soldiers and an estimated 2 Maori died, and the Battle of Battle Hill from 6 to 13 August as British troops, local militia and Kupapa pursued an Aotearoa force led by Chief Te Rangi Hareata through steep and dense bushland. Ngāti Chief Te Rauparahia was also taken into custody during the campaign. He was detained without charge in Auckland for 2 years. The bloodshed heightened settlers' fears in nearby Wanganui, which was given a strong military force to guard against attack. In April 1847, an accidental shooting of a minor Wanganui Maori chief led to a bloody revenge attack on a settler family, when the perpetrators were captured and hanged. A major raid was launched on the town as a reprisal, with homes plundered and burned and livestock stolen. Maori besieged the town before mounting a frontal attack in July 1847. A peace settlement was reached in early 1848. The First Taranaki War. The catalyst for the First Taranaki War was the disputed sale to the Crown of a 240-hectare block of land at Waitara. Despite a veto by the paramount chief of Te Atiaiawa tribe, Wiramukingi, and a solemn contract by local Maori not to sell, Governor Brown accepted the purchase with full knowledge of the circumstances and tried to occupy the land, anticipating it would lead to armed conflict, and a demonstration of the substantive sovereignty the British believed they had gained in the 1840 Treaty of Waitangi. Hostilities began on 17 March 1860. The war was fought by more than 3,500 imperial troops brought in from Australia, as well as volunteer soldiers and militia, against Maori forces that fluctuated between a few hundred and about 1,500. After a series of battles and actions, the war ended in a ceasefire, with neither side explicitly accepting the peace terms of the other. Total losses among the imperial, volunteer and militia troops are estimated to have been 238, while Maori casualties totaled about 200. Though there were claims by the British that they had won the war, there were widely held views at the time they had suffered an unfavorable and humiliating result. Historians have also been divided on the result. Historian James Belich has claimed that Maori succeeded in thwarting the British bid to impose sovereignty over them, and had therefore been victorious. But he said the Maori victory was a hollow one, leading to the invasion of the Waikato. Governor Thomas Gore Browne began making arrangements for a Waikato campaign to destroy the Kingitonga stronghold at the close of the First Taranaki War. Preparations were suspended in December 1861 when he was replaced by Sir George Grey, but Grey revived plans for an invasion in June 1863. He persuaded the Colonial Office in London to send more than 10,000 Imperial troops to New Zealand, and General Sir Duncan Cameron was appointed to lead the campaign. Cameron used soldiers to build the 18 kilometers long Great South Road to the border of Kingitonga territory, and on the 9th of July 1863, Grey ordered all Maori living between Auckland and the Waikato take an oath of allegiance to Queen Victoria be expelled south of the Waikato River. When his ultimatum was rejected, the vanguard of the army crossed the frontier into Kingitonga territory and established a forward camp. A long series of bush raids on his supply lines forced Cameron to build an extensive network of forts and redoubts through the area. In a continual build-up of force, Cameron eventually had 14,000 British and colonial soldiers at his disposal, as well as steamers and armoured vessels for use on the Waikato River. They fought a combined Maori contingent of about 4,000. Cameron and his Kingitonga foe engaged in several major battles, including the Battle of Rangiriri and a three-day siege at Orikau, capturing the Kingitonga capital of Naruawahia in December 1863, before completing the Waikato conquest in April 1864. The Waikato campaign cost the lives of 700 British and colonial soldiers and about 1,000 Maori. The Kingitonga Maori retreated into the rugged interior of the North Island, and in 1865 the New Zealand government confiscated about 12,000 square kilometres of Maori land for white settlement, an action that quickly provoked the Second Taranaki War. The Second Taranaki War between 1863 and 1866, there was a resumption of hostilities between Maori and the New Zealand government in Taranaki, which is sometimes referred to as the Second Taranaki War. The conflict, which overlapped the wars in Waikato and Tauranga, was fueled by a combination of factors: lingering Maori resentment over the sale of land at Waitara in 1860 and government delays in resolving the issue, a large-scale land confiscation policy launched by the government in late 1863, and the rise of the so-called Hauhau movement, an extremist part of the Pai Māori syncretic religion, which was strongly opposed to the alienation of Maori land and eager to strengthen Maori identity. The Hauhau movement became a unifying factor for Taranaki Maori in the absence of individual Maori commanders. The style of warfare after 1863 differed markedly from that of the 1860–61 conflict, in which Maori had taken set positions and challenged the army to an open contest. From 1863, the army, working with greater numbers of troops and heavy artillery, systematically took possession of Maori land by driving off the inhabitants, adopting a scorched earth strategy of laying waste to Maori villages and cultivations, with attacks on villages, whether warlike or otherwise. Historian Brian Dalton noted, the aim was no longer to conquer territory, but to inflict the utmost punishment on the enemy. Inevitably there was a great deal of brutality, much burning of undefended villages and indiscriminate looting, in which loyal Maoris often suffered. As the troops advanced, the government built an expanding line of redoubts, behind which settlers built homes and developed farms. The effect was a creeping confiscation of almost 4,000 square kilometers of land, with little distinction between the land of loyal or rebel Maori owners. The outcome of the armed conflict in Taranaki between 1860 and 1869 was a series of enforced confiscations of Taranaki tribal land from Maori, blanketed as being in rebellion against the government. East Cape War. East Coast hostilities erupted in April 1865 and, as in the Second Taranaki War, sprang from Maori resentment of punitive government land confiscations coupled with the embrace of radical Paemāori expression. The religion arrived on the East Coast from Taranaki in early 1865. The subsequent ritual killing of missionary Carl Volkner by Paemāori followers at Opotiki on the 2nd of March 1865 sparked settler fears of an outbreak of violence, and later that year the New Zealand government launched a lengthy expedition to hunt for Volkner's killers and neutralize the movement's influence. Rising tensions between Paemāori followers and conservative Maori led to a number of wars between and within Māori iwi, with Kupapa armed by the government in a bid to exterminate the movement. Major conflicts within the campaign included the cavalry and artillery attack on Te Tara Te Pane Opotiki in October 1865, in which about 35 Maori were killed, and the 7-day siege of Wararinga in November 1865. The government confiscated northern parts of Uriwera land in January 1866 in a bid to break down supposed Maori support for Volkner's killers, and confiscated additional land in Hawke's Bay a year later after a rout of a Maori party had deemed a threat to the settlement of Napier. Tito Kawara's war flared again in Taranaki in June 1868 as Rifa Tito Kawaru, chief of the Ngāti Ruinui's Ngaruahine Hapu, responded to the continued surveying and settlement of confiscated land with well-planned and effective attacks on settlers and government troops, in an effort to block the occupation of Maori land, coinciding with a violent raid on European settlement on the East Coast by Te Kuti. The attacks shattered what European colonists regarded as a new era of peace and prosperity, creating fears of a general uprising of hostile Maoris. Tito Kawaru, who had fought in the Second Taranaki War, was the most skillful West Coast Maori warrior. He also assumed the roles of a priest and prophet of the extremist Hauhau movement of the Paemāori religion, reviving ancient rites of cannibalism and propitiation of Maori gods, with the human heart torn from the first slain in a battle. Although Tito Kawaru's forces were numerically small and initially outnumbered in battle 12-1 by government troops, the ferocity of their attacks provoked fear among settlers and prompted the resignation and desertion of many militia volunteers, ultimately leading to the withdrawal of most government military forces from South Taranaki and giving Tito Kawaru control of almost all territory between New Plymouth and Whanganui. Although Tito Kawaru provided the strategy and leadership that had been missing among tribes that had fought in the Second Taranaki War, and his forces never lost a battle during their intensive campaign, they mysteriously abandoned a strong position at Tauranga Ikapara, and Tito Kawaru's army immediately began to disperse. Kimball Bent, who lived as a slave with Tito Kawaru's Hapu after deserting from the 57th Regiment, told Cowan 50 years later the chief had lost his mana tapa, or sacred power, after committing adultery with the wife of another chief. Once Tito Kawaru was defeated and the East Coast threat minimized, the alienation of Maori land, as well as the political subjugation of Maori, continued at an even more rapid pace. Te Kuti's War was fought in the East Coast region and across the heavily forested central North Island and Bay of Plenty between government, military forces and followers of spiritual leader Te Kuti Ariki Rangi Te Turuki. The conflict was sparked by Te Kuti's return to New Zealand after 2 years of internment on the Chatham Islands, from where he had escaped with almost 200 Maori prisoners of war and the families. Te Kuti, who had been held without trial on the island for 2 years, asked that he and his followers be left in peace, but within 2 weeks they were being pursued by a force of militia, government troops and Maori volunteers. The pursuit turned into a 4-year guerrilla war, involving more than 30 expeditions by colonial and Maori troops against Te Kuti's dwindling number of warriors. Although initially fighting defensively against pursuing government forces, Te Kuti went on the offensive from November 1868, starting with the so-called Poverty Bay Massacre, a well-organized lightning strike against selected European settlers and Maori opponents in the Matafaro district, in which 51 men, women and children were slaughtered and the homes set alight. The attack prompted another vigorous pursuit by government forces, which included a siege at Ngātapapa that came to a bloody end. Although Te Kuti escaped the siege, Maori forces loyal to the government caught and executed more than 130 of his supporters, as well as prisoners he had earlier seized. Dissatisfied with the Māori King Movement's reluctance to continue its fight against European invasion and confiscation, Te Kuti offered Maori an Old Testament vision of salvation from oppression and a return to a promised land. Wounded 3 times in battle, he gained a reputation for being immune to death and uttered prophecies that had the appearance of being fulfilled. In early 1870, Te Kuti gained refuge from 2 Hoi tribes, which consequently suffered a series of damaging raids in which crops and villages were destroyed. After other Maori iwi were lured by the promise of a 5,000 lire as reward for Te Kuti's capture, Te Kuti was finally granted sanctuary by the Māori king in 1872 and moved to the King Country, where he continued to develop rituals, texts and prayers of his Ringatu faith. He was formally pardoned by the government in February 1883 and died in 1893. A 2013 Waitangi Tribunal report said the action of Crown forces on the East Coast from 1865 to 1869, the East Coast Wars and the start of Te Kuti's War, resulted in the deaths of proportionately more Maori than in any other district during the New Zealand Wars. It condemned the illegal imprisonment on the Chatham Islands of a quarter of the East Coast region's adult male population and said the loss in war of an estimated 43% of the male population, many through acts of lawless brutality, was a stain on New Zealand's history and character.